Hello, everyone. Assistant to the regional manager here, Alicia Swami and Eric Johnson. We're exposing mold. Anyone who is an Office fan knows what this shirt's about. We are coming on because we want to talk about a video by a Better Health guy and Dr. Dorniger recently claiming that CIRS is a tinnos. It's an actino problem, no longer mold illness. And I just wanted to break it down with you, Eric, because boy, we've talked about this so many times before. We have a whole video on CIRS on our YouTube page that all of you guys can go ahead and check out and sort of just see how the surviving mold organization, CIRS-X, and just CIRS in general is just sort of falling apart. Maybe you can just give us a little bit more information, Eric.
It seems rather obvious that a guy who wrote Mold Warriors and Surviving Mold, who suddenly reverses himself and say all that was a mistake and we should have been looking at bacteria rather than mold, has kind of turned his own paradigm upside down. I'm surprised that the mold community hasn't really reacted to this. This is a very dramatic reversal. For all those who thought that CIRS was going to validate their mold illness, well, now they've got a real surprise, because what went from being probable mold illness is probably not mold illness, as attested to by the creator of the CIRS term.
So it seems like if it's not mold illness, why is the organization still calling themselves Surviving Mold?
I guess they're crazy or something. Dr. Shoemaker unleashed with this announcement back in 2019, and that's plenty of time for them to have changed their brand name, and they haven't. And when they're asked about that, they go, well, we use mold as a euphemism for anything inside a water damaged building. No, mold is mold. Come on, people.
What's super interesting is that the Australian Parliament, they went ahead and ruled that CIRS is not an actual real disease. So we have Australia saying CIRS is no longer, or was never, considered a legitimate disease. And now you have people in the organization saying that, CIRS is no longer mold illness. It's like, then what is CIRS? And
Toxic
in that,
stew.
yeah, toxic stew. And that's what that clip was that I had just posted from Better Health guy with Dr. D, where he says CIRS is everything and anything. And so is that sort of a marketing tactic for them to just get any patient that seems to be sick, and then they call it CIRS, and oh, here's our protocol and here's our testing, and spend all this money for you not to have any real answers?
As we've said many times before, I don't understand where Dr. Shoemaker went with this and why, because the idea of an illness name is to refine the search, to narrow down whatever causative agent and the disease is. And he's going the other way. He's turned CIRS into a name for anything and everything except mold illness, which is now being ruled out. So I often wonder what Dr. Shoemaker's original Pfisteria patients, the people who got sick on the Chesapeake, must think of this, because they launched Dr. Shoemaker's path to stardom with getting sick on the shores of the Chesapeake just by inhaling something that was coming off the water, out of the silt, perhaps an algal bloom, something from the Pfisteria, who knows? But now they're being told that they went through a transition of biotoxin illness being thought of as primarily mold in sick buildings, which didn't really relate to them. And now it's back to toxic stew, anything and everything, which is essentially the same thing that doctors have been saying for 150 years. They come up with names like neurasthenia and, even chronic fatigue syndrome was considered a basket diagnosis for anything that we can't figure out. And now CIRS seems to have fallen into that same trap. And I just don't see any use for that, any value to it.
At least for like CFS, there's reporting, there's treatment, there's all that. Of course, they say CFS is anything and anything, but it's an actual ICD code syndrome that is being tracked worldwide. So people are able to obtain data, get numbers, whereas CIRS, there's none of that.
Yeah, as you say, CIRS was always considered by mainstream medical doctors, especially in Australia, as a pseudo-scientific invention of Dr. Shoemaker. Just an impressive, fancy-sounding name that he strung together, not officially accepted by any authorized body, not recognized by the medical profession, at least no one above alternative homeopath chiropractor level. So I could see from the start that there was never any chance for CIRS to become a legitimate ICD coded medical entity. That just wasn't going to happen. You'd have to have some really, really powerful connections between disease agent and studyable disease outbreaks in order to make that happen. And if you turn CIRS into a name for anything and everything from ciguatoxin to Pfiesteria to brown recluse spider bites, and now it's saying even SARS-CoV-2 is a CIRS, it's obviously not legitimate. It can't be. It's a path to nowhere.
Wow. So this is not a legitimate disease, but they sure do market it to make it seem like it is.
Very
And
impressive.
yeah. And as we do know that with our conversations that we've had with attorneys that are helping mold patients in the past, this term CIRS is not even being used in the court of law for litigation.
Seems like that would be an automatic loss. Any sharp lawyer could just examine Dr. Shoemaker's work and go, well, your own leader says that your claims of being sickened by mold are invalid. So that's it. Case closed.
Keely came up with a good question here. She said, if CIRS has been discredited as a real illness in Australia, will that impact how CIRS is perceived worldwide?
Yeah, I believe that eventually other countries are going to see the lack of validation and realize that CIRS isn't going to get them anywhere. And they'll drift away from the term, and the Shoemaker organization will eventually disappear.
So at this point, it just seems like the patient community, because of surviving mold, CIRSEX, their marketing, they've been able to hold this steady. But you sort of see this crumbling and crashing and burning.
Yeah, like I say, it takes a lot for a disease entity to be validated. And it really has to have a strong foundation. It can't be toxic soup. That's just another meaningless name.
I mean, if this organization, Shoemaker, has been riding on the CIRS train and has been pushing its validity, why aren't they trying to make it a real illness? Like, why don't we see their doctors and people in their organization that are running that organization pushing for it to be a legitimate recognized illness, so that way we can obtain data, so that way we do know actually how many people have CIRS in America and what's going on with this illness?
Yeah, I asked that question at the 2019 Fort Lauderdale, Florida Mold Congress. I said, if you've got the goods, then let's take this package to the CDC, NIH, to Dr. Nancy Klimas, only 20 minutes away, famous MECFS immunologist who's got a lot of clout in the chronic fatigue syndrome world. Let's go and present the evidence to these top people. And if it's overwhelming, we should be able to absolutely smoke them, avalanche over these people, get them to accept CIRS as legitimate, incorporate it into their education, and get research and spread awareness and do all the wonderful things that happen when you can prove that you're right. And they made no move to do so. In fact, one of their lead Shoemaker practitioners actually defected from the Shoemaker organization and went to work with Dr. Nancy Klimas and accepted and endorsed her views and ways of looking at things with no mention of Dr. Shoemaker or CIRS. So that tells me that they don't have a package. They don't have the proof. And they certainly don't have the willingness to prosecute this, to bring it to a conclusion.
So what is this science that they keep saying that they are talking about, that they're relying on, that Shoemaker has done? What is this science? Is it just information put into a journal that's willing to accept their information without full validation, or it's alternative journals, or like can you break that down?
Yeah, there's predatory journals of reviewers who are essentially just whores. I mean, they just sold their souls. They don't care about science, and they'll just pass anything through as long as they get their paycheck. And these predatory journals that confer false legitimacy to some of these papers have created an awful lot of trouble in the medical world because most people can't tell that this is just unscientific garbage. They can't tell that these reviewers were just paid off to pass this information through. And unfortunately, Dr. Shoemaker went that route, used these predatory journals, created an impression to his followers that CIRS had been legitimized by medical doctors. No, it hasn't. And the fact that he went that route is in and of itself such a serious discrediting of the approach that's another reason why CIRS is probably never going to go anywhere.
Wow. Some heavy hitting information there, Eric. So the science that everyone keeps talking about that's revolutionary from the Shoemaker org is just being passed through low end medical journals that people can't really tell the difference from a higher quality to a lower quality journal.
Sure. If this was really legitimate science, the first thing a serious researcher would do is take it to Harvard, to Stanford, to the Mayo Clinic, to all the top researchers. They wouldn't publicize it online, try to turn it into a marketing tool, because just imagine if you took it like to Stanford and forced them to recognize it as legitimate, wouldn't that be the ultimate marketing tool? Now you've gone global. Your information will become worldwide news, not something that gets spread in a few blogs on the internet. So obviously, a serious researcher, that is the route they would go. And it's a very telling thing about their lack of confidence in their evidence that they somehow don't see fit to do this.
Wow, that's super hardcore. Yeah, they're going on Better Health Guys podcast instead of going to Stanford and anywhere else to get some legitimacy here. So you made mention of lumping MECFS in with the CIRS paradigm. There was a quote from CFS researcher Dr. Paul Cheney that you had posted or that you had obtained from him, where he talks about CFS and CIRS almost being like the same illness entity, where Shoemaker and Cheney at one point in time were trading patients back and forth. Could you maybe talk about how CFS and CIRS sort of play together?
Yeah, Dr. Cheney released a video in 2013 where he said that chronic fatigue syndrome and CIRS are clinically indistinguishable, that he and Shoemaker swap patients and they can't tell the difference. So, as you know, I was the first prototype for the chronic fatigue syndrome, and I started the syndrome by telling Dr. Cheney about toxic mold and asked, along with the Truckee teachers and various others, that researchers look into the sick buildings, which we suspected to be from mold, but toxic mold wasn't discovered at that time. So we didn't really ask specifically for mold because we knew there was no basis, nothing in the medical literature. We just asked them, look into the buildings on the basis that if they do, they'll stumble over the mold, and then we can get progress with this. But this was never done. And Dr. Shoemaker was the only researcher in the world to read about what happened, identify this as a biotoxin or mold-related incident, and put that in his books. So I wanted to reward Dr. Shoemaker for his service and being the only doctor to do this. And that was my goal in trying to connect chronic fatigue syndrome with CIRS. But I knew at the same time that there was a problem in that Dr. Shoemaker wasn't narrow enough in his projection of what CIRS is to consider them congruent, because the original chronic fatigue syndrome evidence is very specific. Sick teachers in sick buildings, failure to recover from a viral illness in the presence of Stachybotrys. So that's how CIRS and chronic fatigue syndrome got wound up together. And I thought that once this had been mentioned, even once, one time, the researchers would go, oh crap, we need to go back there and figure this out. Figure out what exactly chronic fatigue syndrome is, how this whole confusing thing got started, and what, if any, relationship it has to CIRS. And I asked the Shoemaker group to do that, and none of them saw fit to do so. So there again, a lack of conviction in the scientific process and in their own syndrome entity.
Do you think that with the growing pressure from us, from other patients, I think there were some other patients saying, cholestyramine isn't working, your VIP isn't working, like what else is there? Do you think that they will pursue going to Stanford and all these other higher top level organizations to get more research into CIRS or to validate this illness?
I see no signs at all that they have any intention of pursuing higher level research. It seems like that's the last thing they want. They're trying to just out-publicize everybody else and hope that they can force CIRS to become accepted by sheer force of patients screaming that it must be right. And they obviously haven't looked at the history of the CDC NIH, because that is never going to happen. If something doesn't pass scientific muster in every regard, like a sledgehammer, it's never going to get anywhere. Yeah. So I don't think CIRS is going to go anywhere, but I do believe that exposing mold with what we're doing, by putting pressure on people to explain some of these disparities, we have a better chance of getting the top researchers to listen. Because as all this clamor about what CIRS is and what chronic fatigue syndrome is gets more strident, the top researchers are going to be under increasing pressure to answer what exactly they mean by these terms.
Absolutely. Well, I think that was a really good conversation. I did want to ask one last thing, and I'm not sure if we should even throw this in there, but I'm just really curious because it seems like there's a major obsession with CIRS in like genetics and genetic testing. Is this just another way for them to come up with more tests so they can sell to people to make more money for their organization? Is there any validation for this genetic component that the organization keeps saying there is for people who have CIRS, and that's the HLA-DR genes?
Well, the ex-Shoemaker practitioners, the ones who bailed out and went their own way and joined ICI and others, have said that it's not holding up. They're just not seeing this incredible correlation. And I don't care if it's right or wrong, because that's something for science to work out. What I care about is that science procedure is not being followed here. There's a method for determining what is right and what is wrong. And when I see researchers conspicuously evading the due process of science, then I'm going to call them into question on that.
Very good. Very good answer. Well, no more from me today. Anything else that you'd like to cap this conversation off with, Eric?
No, I think that's enough for today.
All right. Well, everyone tuning in, we're just giving you something to think about as usual, and we'll see you guys next time.